So apparently sometimes BuzzFeed News actually does some real journalism. This is, after all, a news organization whose top trending topics are Trump impeachment, Joe Biden, and Avengers Endgame. And last month they published a 3-part series in which they broke the news of WWF's involvement, the World Wildlife Fund's involvement, with paramilitary groups in African nations. A BuzzFeed News investigation that occurred off of Twitter, go figure. They say the World Wildlife Fund for Nature funds vicious paramilitary forces to fight poaching. Kira Chowdhury went one night with boiled green maize and chicken for her husband Shikuram, a farmer who had been locked up for 2 days. Shikuram was in too much pain to swallow. He crawled towards Hira, his thin body covered in bruises, and told her through sobs that forest rangers were torturing him. They beat him mercilessly and put salt water in his nose and mouth, Hira later told the police. The rangers believed that Shikuram had helped his son bury a rhinoceros horn in his backyard. They couldn't find the horn, but they threw Shikuram in their jail anyway, court documents filed by the prosecution show. 9 days later, he was dead. An autopsy showed 7 broken ribs and blue marks and bruises all over his body. 7 eyewitnesses corroborated his wife's account of the non-stop beatings. 3 park officials, including the chief warden, were arrested and charged with murder. I don't know if the son was or wasn't convicted of poaching. This article seems to implicate that he was. But I gotta say, I believe the father's innocence. If people were beating on my 9 broken ribs, I'd be telling them whatever they wanted to hear. The World Wildlife Fund for Nature had long helped fund and equip Chitwan's forest rangers, who patrolled the area in jeeps, boats, and on elephant back, alongside soldiers from the park's in-house army battalion. Now WWF's partners in the war against poaching stood accused of torturing a man to death. WWF staff on the ground in Nepal leapt into action not to demand justice, but to lobby for the charges to disappear. When the Nepalese government dropped the case months later, the charity declared it a victory in the fight against poaching. And when you think about it, it was a victory against poaching animals and for poaching people. It seems like the sort of thing that PETA would be up for. Then, WWF Nepal continued to work closely with the Rangers and fund the park as if nothing had happened. As for the Rangers who were charged in connection with Shikuram's death, WWF Nepal later hired one of them to work for the charity. It handed a special anti-poaching award. By then, he had written a tell-all memoir that described one of his favorite interrogation techniques, waterboarding. Shikuram's alleged murder in 2006 was no isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that persists to this day. In national parks across Asia and Africa, the beloved non-profit with the Cuddly Panda logo funds, equips, and works directly with paramilitary forces that have been accused of beating, torturing, sexually assaulting, and murdering scores of people. As recently as 2017, forest rangers at a WWF-funded park in Cameroon tortured an 11-year-old boy in front of his parents, the family told BuzzFeed News. Their village submitted a complaint to the World Wildlife Fund, but months later, the family said they still hadn't heard back. Imagine that. WWF says it does not tolerate any brutality by its partners, but WWF has provided high-tech enforcement equipment, cash, and weapons to forces implicated in atrocities against indigenous communities. Villagers have been whipped with belts, attacked with machetes, beaten unconscious with bamboo sticks, sexually assaulted, shot, and murdered by WWF-supported anti-poaching units, according to reports and documents obtained by BuzzFeed News. The charity's field staff in Asia and Africa have organized anti-poaching missions with notoriously vicious shock troops and signed off on a proposal to kill trespassers penned by a park director who presided over the killings of dozens of people. WWF has provided paramilitary forces with salaries, training, and supplies, including knives, night vision binoculars, riot gear, and batons, and funded raids on villages. In one African country, it embroiled itself in a botched arms deal to buy assault rifles from a brutal army that has paraded the streets with the severed heads of alleged criminals. The charity has operated like a global spy master, organizing, financing, and running dangerous and secretive networks of informants motivated by fear and revenge, including within indigenous communities, to provide park officials with intelligence, all while publicly denying working with such informants. And remember this little fact, it'll be important in a few minutes. WWF was established by a small group of mostly British naturalists in Zurich in 1961. The article is quite long and documents the hiring of paramilitary forces, multiple cases of abuse, attempted cover-ups coordinated with the Nepalese government, and similarly the government of Cameroon. And in Cameroon, the WWF has trained government forces, paid their salaries, built them homes, given them radios, satellite phones, TVs, 4x4s, and boats. Parks Management says the WWF will help organize raids known as coup de poings on local villages suspected of harboring poachers. A confidential internal report found that such missions, frequently conducted in the dead of night with the help of police units, were often violent. They've also worked with the Bataillon d'Intervention Rapide, a Cameroonian special forces unit that has been separately accused of killing unarmed civilians. Chitwan Park officials have said, and it's even been published, that some types of torture are done to obtain confessions, such as in the killing of a rhino, which is a very serious case. And as the BBC reported in 2017 at Kaziranga Park in India, they are the park that shoots people to protect the rhinos. Entire villages are being destroyed to make way for extended national parks. At one stage, park rangers were killing an average of 2 people every month, more than 20 people a year. In 2015, more people were shot dead by park guards than rhinos were killed by poachers. And that shot dead, mostly I'm hearing about people being beaten to death. In another Indian park, a man went out looking for firewood and was found beaten to death. 8 park guards were arrested. And the reason? He was suspected of cutting teak trees. Some fellow villagers saw the forest department taking him away. He was brought to one of the rangers' residences. Officials have said that he was beaten to death, and then they burnt his body to attempt to hide the evidence. But the shady dealings between the WWF, mercenary armies, and foreign governments began long before this. I came across this little piece of history while researching for one of my Funding the Fall videos, a video series which looks into the organizations and corporations paying to destroy our culture. And if I weren't about to show it to you, if I were Alex Jones telling you about how the founder of the WWF was a founder of the Bilderberg Group and a former Nazi, you would think I was a raving lunatic. Although he later denied it, it was well documented that he was a member of the Sturm Battalion, the Nazi Party, and was a member of the Reiter SS. A member of German royalty, he married a Dutch queen. And in the 1970s, the Lockheed bribery scandal toppled the Dutch monarchy, causing his queen wife to resign. Prince Bernhard also resigned from his role as Inspector General of the Dutch Armed Forces, and after the scandal he turned over presidency of the International World Wildlife Fund to Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. That name will come up again. After the Lockheed scandal in 1988, Prince Bernhard and Princess Juliana sold 2 paintings from their personal collection to raise money for the World Wildlife Fund. The painting sold for £700,000 sterling, which was deposited into a Swiss WWF bank account. In 1989, however, the next year, Charles de Hayes, Director General of the WWF, transferred $500,000 back to Bernhard for what was called a private project. In 1991, newspapers reported that this private project was Prince Bernhard had hired KAS International, owned by the Special Air Service David Sterling, to use mercenaries, mostly British, to fight poachers in nature reserves. The Special Air Service has little to nothing to do with air service at all and focuses on espionage, infiltration, and sabotage operations behind enemy lines. They're accused by the government of South Africa of training forces to run assassin operations against leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. But to really get to the heart of this story, let's go to the Maclean's article from 1976. The Prince Who Fell from Grace. The Dutch could overlook Bernhard's past, his unsavory connections, even his philandering. He had a bunch of children out of wedlock with the Queen. But his multi-million-dollar deal with Lockheed was unforgivable. By the way, let's stop and take a look at this for a minute. Lockheed briberies were a huge thing. Millions of dollars going to government officials to encourage them to buy Lockheed planes instead of their competitors, or to buy more planes, or planes at all that maybe they might not need. West Germany, Italy, Japan, where it toppled the government and led an actor to commit a suicide attack, a kamikaze attack against one of the accused Tokyo home. Some in Saudi Arabia. And after Prince Bernhard's death in 2004, interviews were published showing he admitted to taking the money, as US court trials found out. Because although many government officials wanted to remain silent, Lockheed admitted to these payments once everything was out in the open. Alright, back to that Maclean's article. No sooner had the first shocks of the royal scandal passed than the Dutch Information Ministry released letters that showed that the princess asked Helmut Schmidt, the West German Chancellor and former defense minister, to purchase planes in 1971 produced by the Northrop Corporation. Rumors also abounded that Bernhard's taste for the high life, his numerous illicit love affairs, and his high-rolling business connections. Published reports claim the prince keeps a mistress named Pussy and an illegitimate child in Paris. At least 3 other mistresses were mentioned in the Dutch press. But the larger question being raised in Europe is how Bernhard's shady operations were kept quiet for so long, and why it took a Senate committee in Washington investigating something quite different to uncover a major scandal extending over the last 20 years and involving millions of dollars. It was the Watergate investigation that discovered that among the companies illegally helping to finance Richard Nixon's 1972 campaign was the Northrop Corporation. Isn't it interesting how everything starts to tie together? When Northrop officials were questioned about how they did it, they explained that they had learned their lessons from Lockheed. The trial led to Lockheed, to the network of agents who worked for both companies, and eventually to Lockheed's acknowledgement that it had paid Bernhard. The subsequent revelations about Bernhard's behavior, with his traces of brazenness and squalor, were painfully embarrassing to the Dutch. Prime Minister Loop den Uyl, in a nationally televised speech in Parliament, said no legal action would likely be taken against Bernhard because of possible serious consequences to Queen Juliana, who married him in 1937. Juliana, who lived in Canada during the Second World War after the Germans overran Holland, appeared deeply shaken initially at least, but she seemed determined to remain on the throne as the head of the House of Orange, where she would for another 3 years or so. Even when Bernhard first married Princess Juliana, the Dutch had some reason to regard him as an unsatisfactory consort. He had been a probationary member of the Nazi SS before the war. American intelligence continued to distrust him during the war, and he was quite soon actively unfaithful to the plain but dedicated princess. However, his wartime record as a pilot with the Allies and as a resistance leader overcame public reservations, and by the time Queen Wilhelmina abdicated in 1948, the Dutch were relieved to welcome a new queen with a consort who represented the spirit of the resistance. The whole notion of marrying the traditional House of Orange with someone familiar with commercial enterprise was strikingly attractive to the Dutch, and Bernhardt's business drive gave the monarchy an up-to-date, forward-looking character which set Holland apart, and noble Dutch industry and, to a degree, Western capitalism as a whole. In 1952, he organized the first of the annual Bilderberg conferences, which served as a meeting place for politicians, bankers, and industrialists such as the Agnellis, Rothschilds, and Rockefellers. They were held in great secrecy. No member was allowed to talk to a journalist, and they were sometimes depicted by the left as representing a great conspiracy of international capitalists. The conferences helped to give Bernhard an almost unrivaled network of international contacts. The web was widened when, in 1961, he set up the World Wildlife Fund, which included an unusual mixture of international aristocrats, naturalists, and ambitious industrialists. In 1974, it looked as though the Orion sale was assured, and Bernhard sent crude, handwritten letters in bad English to Roger Smith, who was then Lockheed's general counsel, requesting between $4 and $6 million as his commission on the $200 million sale. Lockheed sent an agent to the palace to negotiate, and a smaller fee of $1.3 million was agreed upon. Eventually, the Dutch government decided against buying the Orions, and the commission was never paid. Documents released in Washington by the Senate Committee indicate that Lockheed's biggest rival in Europe, Northrop, also had easy access to the prince. To nobody's surprise, the implication that Bernhard was a double agent has outraged Lockheed. The wealth of the House of Orange is believed to be around $600 million, and the prince is paid $300,000 a year by the Dutch government. But he was penniless when he married Juliana, and insiders at the Dutch court say that in the 1960s, he was sorely strapped for cash, perhaps because of extramarital commitments or blackmail. In 1951, he returned from Argentina with a $60 million order from the government of the late President Juan Perón for Dutch railroad equipment. At the time, the only quid pro quo appeared to be a Dutch decorations for Perón's wife Eva. But earlier this year, the Netherlands government disclosed that the deal involved a payoff of $12 million in cash for the Peróns, $1 million in jewelry for Eva, and a deluxe private train for both of them. Bernhard also managed to develop close relations with several businessmen of questionable character, among them Robert Vesco, the fugitive financier wanted in the United States on charges of obstructing justice, embezzlement, and fraud, and Tibor Rosenbaum, accused of defrauding the Israeli government. There was speculation that both men may have provided Bernhard with money in exchange for his efforts to give them an entry to Dutch business circles. Rosenbaum founded the International Credit Bank of Geneva in 1959 and was introduced to the prince by Baron Edmond de Rothschild of the French banking family. Rothschild had placed millions in the ICB on behalf of the Israeli government. In 1967, Life magazine charged that the ICB had served as a laundry for $7 billion to $8 billion of mob money collected in the casinos of Las Vegas and the Caribbean. But Bernard and Rosenbaum remained friends. In 1974, Bernard sold the castle he owned in Holland, Wormelo, for $400,000 to an obscure Liechtenstein firm named Evelima Incorporated. The company turned out to be owned by ICB, and the Dutch press now charged that the sale price was suspiciously low. Less than a year later, ICB was closed and Rosenbaum was accused by Rothschild of fraud in connection with the Israeli deposits. And remember I said earlier to remember Prince Philip, the Duke who took over the WWF from Prince Bernhard? Under its first president, Prince Bernhard, the WWF is said to have wanted to set up a massive national park stretching from South Africa to Kenya. The book, which draws on evidence given to a South African Judicial Commission in 1996, says an SAS veteran-led team of British mercenaries to South Africa in 1989 to train anti-poaching units to combat rhino poachers and dealers. The operation, which failed, was said to have been part funded by Prince Bernhard. An investigation into the affair by Prince Philip found that no WWF funds were used. Imagine that, an investigation into the WWF by the head of the WWF found no WWF fault. That sounds a lot like the investigations we were hearing about at the start of this video. It also documents how Prince Philip, the first president of WWF in Britain, shot a tiger in Ranthambore Park in India shortly before the group was founded. In an interview with Huisman, Philip said, "I've never been big game hunting. No, never. Except that one time in India. The only way you can be sure of getting a reasonable wildlife population is by making sure they are balanced. You can't just leave it to nature." So I put out this video to add some more information to this story and kind of propagate some information that is sort of being lost to time. But I also wanted to show you this little miniature Illuminati, what the book Panda Leaks calls the 1001 Club, as published here in The Guardian, to Prince Bernhard's business, military, and political roles and contacts, the international pay-for-play power broking, and to demonstrate how NGOs use people's altruism to control them. I mean, look here at the bottom of this Guardian article. Apparently they've got a lot more desperate. They're almost Stefan Molyneux levels of desperate here.
You don't need another cup of coffee today. You need to help save the world.
For a virtuous future, it's fdrurl.com/donate. And if not, drop philosophy.
We're with you in the fight to protect the environment by keeping The Guardian's environmental coverage open and accessible. They're saving the world. We can report on changes needed to avoid climate and natural catastrophe. Told you they're saving the world. The choices made by individuals are important, but what The Guardian writes is far more important. But we need to work together for the systemic transformation that will make a real difference. See, what you do doesn't make the real difference, is what The Guardian prints that's the real difference. As well as reporting the facts about what is happening now, we investigate the causes and talk to the people trying to make the future better, but we need our readers' support.
$1.
I used to not mind this little blurb at the bottom, but to go, to save the environment, you need to pay The Guardian. That's pretty fucking shilly of them.
It's an old thing Socrates said many, many years ago. He said, the problem with democracy, you got one guy who says, here are your vegetables and here's your Bowflex.